In this lesson, we'll render the final image of our fox and discuss some compositing effects. Let's begin. The time has come to render the final image of our little fox to share with our friends and family. We've done all the hard work, so all that's left to do is render the image. Let's start by heading to the rendering workspace found up here at the top center. Now we can render our image by going over here to Render, Render Image, or just by hitting F12. The render is done and our fox is looking fantastically fuzzy and downright dapper in their little suit. Obviously I'm a little bit biased as I designed both the model and the class, but I think they look super cute and I hope you do too. Before we call it quits on this lesson, let's discuss some of the compositing effects that are happening behind the scenes. This will help you better understand how I achieved the look of the final image, and we'll even discuss an optional effect that you can turn on if you'd like. Let's head over to the compositing workspace now, found directly to the right of the rendering workspace. I've customized this view slightly to make it a bit more useful for our purposes. On the left side, you'll see a bunch of nodes that are responsible for the effects that I added to the image. I've labeled each one of these nodes so that their effect on the image is more obvious. We'll discuss each of these nodes in a bit more detail in just a moment. And then over here on the right side, you'll likely see either an empty gray box or an image of the fox that we just rendered. If you don't see the fox render over here in this right viewport, go up to the left here where it says Backdrop, click this button to turn it on, and then click it again to turn it off. That should reload the image so that it pops up over here on the right side. Okay, so what do all of these nodes here on the left actually do? First, let's see what the image looks like without any of the effects applied. We can do this by clicking on this little yellow dot here on this far left node. We're going to click here at the top, and we're just going to move it and place it here on this small dot here before the last two nodes. So we're bypassing all of these nodes. This will show us what the actual raw render looks like over here on the right side. We'll notice that the image hasn't changed drastically, but there are some notable differences. Overall, the image is a bit darker, the subtle glow is missing from the highlights, and the minimal rainbow blur along the edges of the image is also gone. Let's go through each of these nodes quickly and hook them up so that we can get an idea of what they actually do. First up is this node over here that I have labeled Brighten Image. So to connect this back to the image, we're just going to click from this little yellow dot here on the right side of this node, and then drag it over here to this dot here. So now we're only using just this node in the image. And now if we zoom in on this node, we can see here that this is actually called Exposure. This Exposure node is simply responsible for controlling the exposure of the image. I've increased the exposure down here slightly just to brighten up the image overall. Values higher than 0 will make the image brighter, and values lower than 0 will make the image darker. The next node in the system is here, and I've labeled this one Glow. So let's connect that to the system. We'll drag from Image here at the top, over here again to this small dot, and the name of this node is actually Glare. So that's what you would search to find it in the list if you needed to. This Glare node has a few different modes that add lens flares or subtle glows to the highlights of your image. For this image, I have it set to the Fog Glow mode, but you can see here there are a few different options. The Fog Glow mode is one of the more simple options that just adds a soft blurry glow around the brightest areas of the image, such as the tips of the ears or the highlights of the eyes. So if we zoom in over here on the right side of this ear, you can see that there's this kind of soft yellowy glow that extends past the edge of the model, and that's because of this glare node. You might also see it around here, around the edges of this highlight on the eye. There's just a kind of brightness that sort of emits from these highlights. As a quick example, if I zoom out here, I can bypass this instead to show you what it looks like without it. You can see here all that glow that we saw on the eye is now gone. You also saw it lose a little bit of glow down here on the white part of the fur. So if I re-enable it, we can see here this glow is now added back to the image. This just helps the bright parts of our image seem even brighter than they were before. And now the last effect that we have applied to the image before was this rainbow blur one that I have labeled here. So before we re-enabled this, let's zoom out a little bit. We're going to go down here to the bottom right so we can see these mushrooms, as this is a really obvious place to see this effect. Now let's re-enable this effect by dragging from this yellow dot and then dragging it over here. This rainbow blur node is actually called Lens Distortion. This node does a few different things, but we're using it to add a subtle rainbow blur effect to the edges of the image. The slider responsible for this rainbow effect is the dispersion value found down here on the bottom. And you can see I have a relatively low value set. If I set this to 0, we can see what it looks like before I added it. So we can see that we have nice sharp edges here, obviously. And then if I set it back to 0.01, we can see this subtle rainbowy blur. It's pretty obvious here on these mushrooms, as we're seeing a red and yellow fringe on the top, and then we're seeing kind of a bluish green fringe on the bottom. That's because this effect here is mimicking a real world effect called chromatic aberration, in which the glass of the camera lens acts as a prism and splits the white light into separate colors. So that's what it's mimicking, this effect here. So we're seeing this white light being split into its different channels. This is also somewhat of an optional effect, but I do think it enhances the overall look of the image and gives it a little bit of realism, as this is an effect that you do see with real-world cameras. Even though it's technically a defect, it does add to the realism. We can also see it here on the edges over here, so each of these hairs is just a little bit blurry and the colors are a little bit shifted off of each other. This lens distortion effect only happens along the edges of the image though. To the very center of this image, you're not really going to see any of this effect, especially at such a low value. At really, really high values, you might start noticing it, but really you're only seeing this subtle effect here along the very edges of the frame. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the effects that we already had applied to the render, let's discuss that one last optional effect that adds a fun twist on the image. And that last node is over here to the right side, and I have it labeled Painterly Effect Optional. This node isn't currently connected to the system. You can tell that because there's nothing being output here on the right side. The actual node associated with this effect is called the Kuwahara node. And what this does is it filters your image in a way that makes it resemble somewhat like an oil painting. So let's zoom in here on the right side of our fox. So we can see an area that has a lot of different versions of the hair. So some in the back here that are long and some that are short. Now if we drag from the right side of this node up to this dot here to connect it to the system, we'll see the actual effect of this node. So now that we have this Kuwahara effect added to the image, we can see that all those fine strands of hair have been much more simplified down into what resembles basically brush strokes. The whole image has this kind of oil paint filter applied on top of it. It still looks obviously like this has some fuzz and hair to it, but it's a lot less detailed and a bit more stylized, which might be an effect that you like. You also have some effect over what this painterly effect looks like on the image by changing these parameters here on the left. So if you adjust this size value to a larger number, you'll notice that this painterly effect becomes a little bit less detailed. Overall, it's a bit more smooth and it's a bit more brushstroke looking. So let's set this back to 8. And if we make the size smaller, it'll make the brushstroke smaller and the image overall will be a bit more detailed. The uniformity value below that changes how rough and granular the brushstroke effect is. If you use a lower value here, such as 5, it'll make these brushstrokes a bit more rough and a bit more noisy. Overall, this effect is pretty subtle. I'm going to set this back to 10. The sharpness value here controls how sharp the borders between each of these colors and the brushstrokes are. If you use a much lower value, such as 0.25, will make for a significantly blurrier image. So you can see now that this image has a lot more blur to it, and it kind of looks like the whole image is just kind of being smoothed over with some sort of effect. I'll leave this set to 1. And then lastly, we have somewhat of a complicated effect. So the eccentricity controls whether the brushstrokes will follow the high contrast edges of the image, or whether the brushstrokes will just be randomized regardless of the image. If you have a lower value set, you'll tell the brushstrokes to just kind of randomly be painted across the image and not really care too much about which direction this edge is flowing. We can see here that the image has kind of almost like a honeycomb pattern across it. However, higher values will tell Blender in this effect to follow the edges of the image the best that it can. So you'll start seeing more directional brushstrokes, ones that actually look like they've been painted upward or downward to match the image below. In general, this effect usually looks better when you have a higher eccentricity value. And as I mentioned before, this effect is entirely optional. I can understand why you might not want to use it, as it does somewhat minimize the look of the fuzz that we just added. But if you like it, feel free to leave it on. For now, I'm going to turn mine off just by bypassing this node and running this last node here to the dot instead. Once you've decided which version of the image that you like the most, or if you'd like to save both of them, you can also do that. We can now save our image. To save the image, all we need to do is go up here to where it says Image, and then choose Save As. Now navigate to wherever you'd like to save this image on your computer, and then we can change the name down here. So I'll just call this Fox Render _ Final _ 01 to give it a version number. For the file format, PNG works perfectly fine if you'd like that, or if you want, you could also switch it to a JPEG, and then I would recommend just turning this quality up to 100%. Either one of these options work, so either JPEG set to 100%, or just using the default PNG works fine as well. Once you've picked your file format and your name, you can hit Save As Image. If you'd also like to save a version of it with this painterly effect applied, you can just reattach this painterly effect, and then go over here to Image, save as, and then again, we can just click on this to make sure it's using the same name. And then down here, we can add another underscore and then type in painterly if we'd like, and then hit save as image down here to save a second version of the same image, one with the painter effect and then one without. And now at this point, we're just about done with the class. However, we still have one more topic to cover before we end. In the next lesson, we'll discuss the ways that you can customize this Fox render to make it unique to you. I'll see you there.